Still got a kind of Bin Laden cave.
That's
there
better.
We go. That's a little better. All right. Well, we're streaming. We're live.
We're live, although you can see a tiny bit of our background.
Oh, yeah. Let me angle that.
There we go.
There we go. Ah. No, that's not working.
No. Hello, everybody.
I can adjust that.
Thank you. While he's adjusting the backdrop, welcome to Midweek Mochas, your weekly check-in and coffee with us. Are we good now?
I don't know. You tell me. You're the one looking at the camera.
Yeah, we're fine.
I'm just futzing with the scenery here.
All right. So,
good morning, homeschoolers. It's 0630. What's the O stand for? Oh my gosh, it's early. I need coffee.
Yes. So
welcome to Midweek Mocha.
Yes, I hope you have brought your warm, tasty beverage that helps you get, oh, hello. It helps if I can hear this. This week's show note is going to be make sure that you've got the pre-flight checklist started at 5:30, not 6.
I told you that.
Alrighty. Well, if you can't tell, we're feeling a little overwhelmed today, which is actually the theme of today's stream. So,
I know none of this was staged. We really are just that out of it this morning.
Which is kind of normal, really, when you think about it, because it's just an aspect when you're trying to do a lot of things, and goodness knows homeschooling is trying to do a lot of things. You're going to feel overwhelmed. And there's lots of reasons why, which is actually the hardest part, is that when you start having that sense of heart racing and panic and help, it's because you don't know what on earth it is. And so the hardest part is actually getting started and saying, okay, what on earth is overwhelming me?
Well, yeah, I mean, a struggle everyone has if you get into that kind of fight or flight panic mode, particularly if you're given to anxiety, is detachment.
Yeah.
And being able to take a deep breath and step back and assess the problem objectively and then come up with solutions.
Which means that probably the first step to handling overwhelm is coming up with a reset button that you can have to just sort of step back and say, okay, let's see if we can find what's making me feel overwhelmed so that you can start dealing with it with a tool that's actually going to address the problem.
See, I don't necessarily find that for me.
Okay.
I don't find trying to identify what's causing a panic attack or anxiety is helpful.
Okay.
Because it can be generalized, non-specific. It doesn't necessarily have a cause. Some of that's, just health issues. Some of that's work. Some of that's, the results of choices I've made. So for me, it helps to work the problem.
Okay.
And focus on working the problem. Okay, I'm overwhelmed. I'm new. If I'm new to homeschooling, and we ran into this when we were new to homeschooling.
Yes.
Home education in general, but this is true. This can be true in a job. This can be true in interpersonal relationships. It's true when kids go off to an institutional school. Whether the grammar school, middle school, high school, certainly college, everyone has that adjustment.
Definitely.
If they go to college. If you go into a trade, there are those moments where you're sort of knee deep in whatever it is you're doing. I had that experience when I was working for the Shakespeare Festival in Colorado, 20 plus over almost 25 years ago.
Okay.
I worked as a carpenter one summer, and it was a great opportunity and it was a great job, but it was wholly overwhelming. I was surrounded by all these people who seemed to know what they were doing, and I knew some of the tools and I knew some techniques. I wasn't a completely naive at scenic carpentry. I'd worked professionally as a scenic carpenter for a couple of years.
But you'd moved to a bigger pond.
I had moved to a much bigger pond, and it was very overwhelming. It was very intimidating. And I distinctly remember one day where I screwed something up so royally It basically blew part of the budget, and it set us back like 3 days
Mhm.
on a build schedule that didn't have any space. And I broke down. I ended up going to, like, a bathroom stall and just bawling my eyes out
Yeah.
and thinking how much I hated my life. And then once I pulled myself together, it was like, okay, work the problem. It's metal that I cut and welded the wrong way. This was apparently expected since I was essentially an apprentice to the organization, not, I wasn't a lead. I was where I was supposed to be, and they expected that I would screw up a certain amount of everything I was handed. That failure was expected. It was part of the learning experience, and everybody was cool with it. And I got over the great thing I got out of that experience was, okay, nobody's going to hate me, fire me, or kill me if I screw something up.
Yeah.
And at least when I take time to step back and look at when and how I tend to have anxiety issues, and this, I swear, this does get back to homeschooling. We're going LA by way of Omaha, but please bear with us.
No, this is good.
When I have a chance to rationally assess what happened in the aftermath, what I normally see is that it's what's driving the attack isn't the thing external.
Yeah.
It's the internal sense of I'm not good enough, or I'm a failure. People aren't going to like me, love me. People are going to hate me. If I get worried about something at my jobs, oh, they're going to fire me. Well, if I step back and realize, okay, I generally do a very good job. There are essential things I bring to the team that my team still needs. We're in a super tight labor market. All of these things should play into a rational calculus. The thing about panic is it's not rational. It's an animal response at a very, very low level in the brainstem. So people new to home education, and we certainly went through this
Yeah.
15, 20 years ago, it's overwhelming. It is overwhelming. There is too much information to process. There are too many options. I remember my grandmother years and years and years ago complaining there were too many toothpastes in the toothpaste aisle.
Okay.
And I was studying economics at the time, and I was just baffled by the idea that there could be too much choice, too many options. Like that didn't even compute. Well, I'm a little older and I'm a little more experienced and I'm a little less naive. And God bless my grandmother, I now completely understand why having 500 options of toothpaste in the local grocery store, this wasn't even a supermarket, this was just like the local grocery store, was overwhelming to her. She wanted toothpaste. And if it come in like a white box with black block lettering that just said toothpaste, she would have been happy to buy that.
And I think some of that was one of the reasons that I find that people get overwhelmed is that once you've got, there's the generalized anxiety disorder area of things where it's like, okay, first of all, I want to say
It's a clinically diagnosable problem.
it is clinically diagnosable. It is frequently comorbid if you happen to be ADD and don't realize it. Because
Well, whether you realize it or not, it's comorbid.
Yes.
It's exacerbated if you don't realize
And
that.
so one of the reasons you may be feeling it is that you don't realize that your brain is arranging things differently from perhaps what's normal,
Or how you expect your brain to arrange things.
and there's a degree of panic when you're having trouble keeping all the information together. And I've got definite thoughts on how to help with that later. But I think that one of the things that you definitely run into is when you're not sure what your criteria is, it's really hard to make choices and filter information, and everything's too much information when you're not sure what you're looking for. And I think so that starting point is that sort of begin with the end in mind is one of those ways to help, because maybe one of the reasons you're feeling overwhelmed is you've got this general idea of I'm looking for information on homeschooling, and you just get hit with whoosh everything.
And unfortunately, if you ask people who are homeschooling, everybody's got their opinion. And we certainly have our opinion. What we hope to do here, what we're trying to do this morning is, okay, take a step back, take a deep breath. You've got this. The fact that you're juggling this experiment in the first place means that you can do it. It really does.
Mhm.
So what we hope to lay out in the next, 20 minutes or so is what are some criteria you can use in order to evaluate your options and decide what's best for you. Because what's best for us right now may not be what's best for you, whoever you happen to be. And what's best for us right now wasn't necessarily what was best 6 months ago, 3 years ago.
Yeah.
And it may not be what's best in another year or two.
Yeah.
Our homeschooling experiment, our home education experiment, it changes.
Yeah.
It adapts and it adjusts and it overcomes the obstacles that life throws at it. Whether it was my chronic illness
Yeah.
over the last couple of years, whether it's
we've had you working from home, we've had you working out of the home,
yeah,
and that is significant because even when you're not the primary teacher, and actually there have been weeks where he's been doing more of the teaching than I have, even when you're not,
that division of labor has not been consistent over the last couple of decades. It is shifted frequently depending on whether you're healthy and high energy, I'm healthy and high energy, how busy one or the other of us is. When I was doing my MBA work,
Mhm.
I didn't have the time to help out with the homeschooling.
No.
You shouldered all of that and everything else, and I was not a particularly pleasant person to be around for that year and a half.
Yeah.
So yeah, it can be done. It's a question of prioritizing. And so how do you prioritize? What are the criteria you can use?
And I think it really the starting point has to be, what are you trying to do? Because it's one thing to say, well, I'm homeschooling. I'm doing schoolwork at the house as opposed to sending them to an institution instead. But at that point, the next place is like, okay, what's my goal? And figuring out what is your end goal for education is going to start giving you that shape of the education and help you look and see options that really don't meet your needs versus ones that are going to be in line with what you're trying to achieve.
So that's a really good point. Well, let's kind of dial into what that looks like,
Mhm.
and give some examples. But then I want to make sure we come back to what if you don't know what you're looking for?
Okay. That is a fair thing. And so in terms of like, trying to figure out what your goals are, for an example, you read a book years ago called Climbing Parnassus.
Tracy Lee Simmons, Climbing Parnassus.
I'll make sure to put it in the show notes. I need to like go back, rewatch, and make sure I get some notes on some of these previous
I'm going to
ones.
grab a notepad so I
Thank
can
you.
keep a list of these so you can add them to the show notes later, because pre-flight checklist. Pre-flight checklist.
Yes. Which
Let me knock over the set.
so actually that gives me a thought. Remember, one of your tools is the checklist. It really is a useful thing. And if one of the things that helps keep you from getting overwhelmed is just not having to keep everything in your brain, have that.
When you took up bullet journaling,
Yes.
your ability to organize and manage information without chronic panic attacks improved dramatically.
Yes.
I would also point out that when we had some folks over for one of the kids' birthday parties a few months ago, one of the mothers was really, really, really interested and impressed in the sort of bullet journal style checklists you had on one of the whiteboards in here for like tasks the kids needed to do and tasks we needed to do in order to like prep for the party and all, which it was still up. We hadn't cleaned that board off before the guests arrived. But you, in the last year or so, have been experimenting with trying to get the kids more self-sufficient by using their notebooks.
Yeah.
And giving them, and to the point where the older ones can now replicate that. Oh, all right, I need to do the same kind of stuff next week on these days. And we need to make sure we do a show where we kind of show examples of what does that look like.
Yeah, I definitely need to do that. And I could,
because your bullet journaling is very different from my bullet journaling. You
very
go for the more artistic and elaborate, creative kind, and mine's
Because
like
if it's
a to-do list with little bullets.
because
and
if it's pretty, I like looking at it. But also because spending some time with doing the art of it gives me time to sort of consider things. And as I'm, trying to decide, what washi tape do I want and what color scheme do I want for the week, that does help sort of let all of the, oh, that's right, I had that thing I wanted to do bubble up. And I can get those onto the calendar and start planning my time ahead of time. But back to Tracy Lee Simmons. So you had read a book years and years ago by Tracy Lee Simmons called Climbing Parnassus. And it's an apologia for classical education, meaning the study of Greek and Latin, specifically classical as that deep dive into the ancient world through its languages. And that it's not just, language as a block of study, but once you have unlocked the key to those cities, you have the key that unlocks those cities. Get my metaphors right. When you have that, you can then dive into the actual mind of the ancient world. And that inspired you and said, that's what I want. I want to, even if I can't do it completely, I want to be able to hand that on to my kids. I want to give them that. And from there, you started looking at, well, okay, what's a good way to teach Latin? Because there's certain ways that seem more effective than others. And
that helped us filter course material. Because, to take Latin as an example, there are probably 100 different Latin programs that you can buy.
Mm-hmm.
Some complement each other, many don't.
Yep.
A lot of what's sold as classical in the homeschool marketplace isn't.
Yeah.
It's that's a show unto itself.
Yes, there's
but so once you have an idea of your end goal, okay, I want my kids to learn Latin. I want to start them learning it as essentially as soon as they can, if not, well, we initially started with once they can read, and we've since realized that you can start teaching them Latin very effectively before they can read.
Because what you're trying to do is not do here's a lesson and here's a workbook for exercises. Once you realize that language is acquired. It is acquired.
It's an oral phenomenon.
Yes.
It's
people
it has to do the way language is processed by the brain is it comes in through the ear and it comes out through the mouth, and it involves those brain processes. You can learn to read language, which we do, but for many people, they still audiate what they see. So as you're reading a text in a book with your eyes, a lot of people, and I know I'm one of them, hear that text in their mind. And historically, people read aloud.
Yes.
There's a passage in St. Augustine, in his Confessions, I believe, where he's talking about walking in on St. Ambrose of Milan, reading silently to himself. And it took Augustine a moment to figure out what was Ambrose doing. He was standing at the lectern with the book, and his lips were moving, but no sound was coming out.
And it's helpful to realize for context that Augustine at this point was very, very well educated.
As was Ambrose.
Yes.
And this is remind me of Augustine's dates. The 5th century?
I think so.
Early 5th century, late 4th century?
Yeah.
Late 300s, early 400s, I believe. But that language is an oral phenomenon. It has to do with the mouth and the ears.
Yes.
And so you can start teaching a language. And I remember we got Muzzy for our oldest because they had an Italian language version. And he learned a little bit of Italian. I mean, he couldn't have gone to Italy and had a conversation, but when you take young children to a foreign country and immerse them in that culture, they'll pick that language up very quickly. We had classmates. I'm thinking of one in particular. His father got not a Rhodes Scholarship, maybe it was a Fulbright, something like that, when he was like 3.
One of those scholarships that lets you study in foreign countries.
And so they went to somewhere in Southeast Asia.
Was it Singapore?
No, because wherever they went, English was not the first language.
Okay.
I forget where, maybe it was Thailand. But regardless, they ended up in Southeast Asia. He's like 3.5 or 4 years old. And by the time they left 2 years later, he was fluent in the local language, fluent in, I believe, both French and English.
Yeah.
because his parents were and anyway, that's a whole series of stories. Anyway, where we're trying to go is, kind of bringing it back to where we were.
Yeah.
Criteria help you filter out the noise so that you can find the signal.
And then, as a complete contrast to, being inspired by study of classical languages and wanting to build your homeschool experience around that, let's say that you're doing something really different. Like, that you're doing homeschooling for this year, and you're not sure if you're ready to commit to doing it. I mean, I have a friend of ours, they became lifelong homeschoolers, but it started out with being pulled aside after her son's first grade year. And she said, your son is amazing, and I know who he's likely to have next year. And I think it would be a tragedy if he was in that class, because it's just not going to be a good fit. And I would like to suggest that you read and she gave a book recommendation, and homeschool for a year. And so for that year, they homeschooled, and they had such a good time that they knew that after that they were just going to do that for life.
Yeah.
But for that year, if you're only doing this for a year, maybe you're trying to say, my goal is to make sure that if we re-enroll next year, my child's going to be able to stay in line with where his peer group is and not be lost. And that's where your focus is making sure that, you're keeping on track with where your school district is roughly. If you get ahead, great. But you just want to make sure that if they get back in, they're still reading where they ought to be reading, that they've kept up with the maths that are expected to be appropriate for their ages. And that in general, if they're gone for a year and they return next year, they're going to be where they are. And that means that's a completely different set of things you have to research. You have to say, roughly where they're supposed to be in the subject areas they are studying. How do I make sure that I've documented what they need?
By the institutional standards.
Yes.
It's the institutional standards, like recommended daily allowances, are arbitrary.
Yeah.
There's no scientific research backing any of this up.
But it's more the case of this would be if you're doing this for a year and you expect to be back in an institution next year, what do you need to do to make sure that that's going to be a smooth transition? And
we have friends who've done, we probably have as many friends who experimented with home education.
Yeah.
And then put their kids back into institutional schools for any number of reasons, as we do who pulled them out. And then there's a small group of folks who are in our circle who we've just always homeschooled. Mm-hmm. We made not so much an ideological decision, but certainly philosophical and pedagogical choices.
Yeah.
So.
And that's the thing. And then, you've got a different course. If your goal is college prep, then if you realize very early, it's like if you hit high school and you're looking at your kid and you're saying, you know what, this is someone who's probably going to be better off if they pursue entrepreneurship or if they pursue a trade. There are still academic requirements that they're going to have if they're going on those directions, but they're going to be a difference in the focus. And you're not as obsessed with, how are they going to do on the SATs as, am I making sure that they've got the best foundation for where they want to go in life?
I have an acquaintance on LinkedIn who's he's a founder. I want to say he's in Malaysia. If he's not, I apologize. I know he's in Southeast Asia. And he went to, I want to say it was Oxford, and he worked in investment banking, and now he's a founder of a technology startup in Southeast Asia. And he's been writing periodically over the last few years about his family's home education journey.
Yeah.
That he and his wife decided to home educate their kids.
Mm-hmm.
Well, his kids are, I want to say they're early teens now.
Yeah.
And they've taken all of the
13, 15.
They've taken all of the British schooling system, like college entrance level exams, the A levels and whatnot. And his kids have done very well at them. All of his kids, as far as I can tell from what he's writing, are interested in going an entrepreneurial route. So they just decided between like the ages of 11 and 14 to just get all of the hurdles out of the way. If they want to go to college, they can. If they don't, they don't have to. I've got another friend in the entrepreneurial world who he's got a couple of kids that are fairly sure that they have no real interest in going to college. He doesn't really think that would benefit them, but he's found some sales training that he thinks it would be very important for the kids to have.
Mhm.
I think we're really far afield, though, of helping people sort through being overwhelmed. We're just overwhelming them again, aren't we?
Yes, which is why I'm trying to stay focused on there are, your starting point is to say, where am I trying to get to? And if you know where you're trying to get to, even if that's a temporary thing that changes, every once in a while you reassess and say, is that still where we're trying to go? And that might be the place where you can say, maybe I'm feeling overwhelmed because we've been trying to go one direction and I'm feeling called in a different direction and trying to sort out that. So that's one of the reasons you could be overwhelmed, is that you haven't actually sorted out what you're trying to do, and so you're trying to do everything. Or you haven't been sure where you're trying to get it all, and so you're getting all this information and you can't sort it out and figure out what's useful from what's not. You end up with a really bad signal to noise ratio because you're not even sure what the signal is that you're looking for. And so asking that question of what is my goal, and then refining down as you're filtering through all that information, helps you to say that's useful information, that's not useful information, that's interesting, but it may not be where we're at right now.
Do you have a concrete example of that you could share with our audience?
Sure. Let's say that you're in a state that requires a really lengthy binder of information that you have to turn into some authority every year.
Which is not a state we live in.
No, thankfully not. Which allows us a lot more freedom in terms of how we choose to grade material and do a whole host of other things. We can do a lot more mastery learning rather than specific grading.
You can do mastery learning even if you've got to deal with that kind of portfolio. Some of that just has to do with how do you approach the reporting versus the education.
But if you've got a documentation heavy requirement in your state, unschooling and everything about unschooling may just be unuseful information, because as appealing as it might be to allow for a much more student directed experience, you may find that that's just going to be too much of a burden to try to figure out how do I document the fact that I let my kid go wander off in the woods for 2 days and they've come back with this whole fascinating science fairish type of observations about nature. And it's been a hugely educational experience, but you have no clue how to explain that you've had 2 days worth of nature study.
So I'd really say the first criteria in helping you determine what your goal is separate the idea of schooling from the idea of education.
Yeah.
Recognize that education is a lifelong process that is natural to human beings. It occurs naturally when we encounter things we are interested in or people we like who are interested in other things. The number of topics I ended up studying because a friend of mine was just mad for whatever. I had a buddy who was really into flight simulators. I got into flight simulators for a little while as a teenager. They bored the hell out of me. I realized I probably didn't want to be a pilot as a professional vocation because I couldn't stand doing sims.
Mhm.
And I didn't care about the physics and whether the physics was being well modeled by the polygons in the game and this, that, and the other stuff my kids talk about all the time.
Yeah.
We've got one who might end up wanting to be a pilot because he really is interested in all of that sort of stuff.
Although he's more interested in getting his little aliens to the moon and back.
He's moved on to a flight sim.
Oh, okay.
And he's been working with a flight sim lately.
Yes.
So
you're trying to figure out what are you trying to do, and also what are the parameters that you're working in. Like I said, if you're in a state that's got very heavy reporting requirements, that's going to be an aspect of what are you trying to do and what is,
it puts constraints.
Yeah, it's a constraint.
So when I'm approaching these questions within my work life,
Mm-hmm.
I have a process.
Yeah.
And that process allows me to navigate 90% of the challenges I have in my business and professional life.
What's the desired end state? What are the constraints?
What's the current state?
What's the current state?
What's the desired end state? What are the constraints to getting there? And a lot of people will think of constraints as money. Money is certainly a constraint. But time's the bigger constraint because time is non-renewable.
Yes. And that's where you can look and you can say, this idea looks beautiful, but it becomes impractical if I'm trying to do it with 6 children. Or that idea is great, but that's a program we don't have the budget for. Is there a different way to come at that end? There's lots of constraints that can actually be very freeing, because they can help you say, all right, these are things that help give me a clear fence fenced area I have to work within. And that's actually as freeing as having a writing prompt, which, gives you I have to write about this, question, not I just have to write, which can actually be very overwhelming. And we'll get back to his design process in a moment. But one of the other things that I find overwhelming, and I am sure that most people find overwhelming, is when you get that information overload. It's like, okay, great. I know where I'm trying to get, I know where I'm at, and I know roughly what I'm trying to work within. And I've got a pretty specific question that I'm trying to answer, to figure out what's the best Latin program. And you just get overwhelmed with information.
Or maths.
Maths is a good one, because
we went through this with math. Everybody's got an opinion on math program.
Yeah. You've got one person like, oh, hey, Becca, just use that, or Singapore, use Singapore, or I just use Khan Academy, and everyone has got their idea of what is.
Saxon was really popular when we were.
Singapore was huge.
Well, Saxon and Singapore were popular, but a lot of the people we talked to thought that they basically did the same thing, and they don't. They come from completely different pedagogical perspectives.
Yeah.
And while you as a home educator don't necessarily need to dive into pedagogical theory, I happen to do so because it interested me. Laura didn't. She let me do the research and then give the executive summary recommendations. And then we looked at what other constraints we had.
And that's actually the key here with information overload. If you're finding yourself overwhelmed by the deep well, look for the executive summary.
And that's part of why we aren't starting this channel off with, hey, this is what we use, you should do this, because you're trying to find your way. Just as we're still nearly 2 decades into this experiment, continuing to adjust and try and find our way. And as we were talking about, I think it was on last week's stream, we've gotten, we grabbed a textbook and some workbooks because we wanted to fill in a gap, and it works really well for a couple of our kids.
Yeah.
And it works really poorly for a couple of other of our kids. And okay, well, then that's not going to be a good approach for those kids. We need to find a better path to the goal, which is, do they at least have a passing knowledge of geography and world culture and a general overview of the sweep of history?
Yeah.
So,
and but dealing with information overload, part of that problem is that, sometimes even when you're clear on what you're trying to find, you need to sort of look and say, okay, what's the executive summary? So if you're trying to compare several different math programs, you're going to look and say, okay, what are the 5 points that make this distinguished from this other program? And use that as your thing before you start diving deep into any particular one. Because if you start getting the long sales format for any of them, it can just be too much information.
Yeah.
And you're not sure if you've got the time to do that for every single one to filter out. And so if you look and say, okay, well, this one is really expensive and I already know we don't have the budget, or, oh, this one uses lots of manipulatives and I've got a kid who seems to approach everything through very hands-on things. This may actually be the one I want to dive into more. And then before you know it, you've got enough of a handle that you're willing to take in more information, but you needed that top level summary to say this was worth my time.
And there are homeschool review sites from a variety of perspectives. I know there are some for explicitly Christian homeschoolers. They tend to be evangelical. I think there's a couple for like Catholic homeschoolers. I know there are some for secular. I know there are a couple of explicitly atheist. And at least if some of the people I knew a few years back are still homeschooling and still blogging and so forth, there were some explicitly like neo-pagan. I haven't run into like Buddhist and Hindu and Muslim, but I am certain they're out there. I just haven't looked for that. So regardless of kind of what worldview you want to come at it from, or if you want to get a different perspective, um, we're a particularly religious family, but I've found a lot of secular resources to be ideal, because I can I can work with the editorial assumptions in most secular texts, better than I can work with the editorial assumptions in a lot of explicitly Christian, particularly evangelical works.
Mhm.
Um, and at least the way we handle that, and this is something that we really should probably do a show on at another time, is I'm not trying. We aren't homeschooling to shield our children from particular worldviews.
Yeah.
So, our kids know what's going on in the world. They're not in some sort of hermetically sealed bubble where they don't know about various things going on, whether people get upset about those or not. But those events and conversations about them are what we're looking to stimulate. And so if a video program we're watching or a book we're reading has a perspective that Laura and I particularly disagree with, we'll go ahead and lay it out. And then we will follow Thomas Aquinas's maxim of always articulate your opponent's arguments better than they could.
Yeah.
And we'll try and give them a fair hearing. And sometimes we'll have a debate or discussion. Sometimes we'll just walk through, okay, these are the points and these are the assumptions that support these points from this perspective. We disagree, and this is where we're coming from. And we invite the children to engage the ideas.
Yeah, I mean, we're currently watching a video series on the Italian Renaissance, and it's fascinating because the lecturer's got a at the very start points out where do his particular biases lie,
Mhm.
and it's a fascinating thing. We've discovered it's like you're more of a sort of Renaissance Christian humanist,
yeah,
and I'm more of a medieval.
My frame of reference is rooted very deeply in Renaissance humanism.
And my own is much more medieval.
Yes, very, very medieval. And that's not a pejorative. That really needs to be clarified.
No, it's just more of a sense of worldview of how you view the order of the world and its purpose. And the funny thing is that we still share a large chunk of
it's for us, it's very complementary.
Yeah.
I can see where in other people it might create conflict.
Yeah.
I can think of some friends of ours who the husband has a very, very medieval view of things, not dissimilar from yours.
Yeah.
The two of you are very simpatico on a lot of things. His wife not so much, and that causes some friction.
Yeah.
So but back to these sorts of points on, okay, how do you being overwhelmed? First, take a deep breath and realize you've got this. Figure out what goal you're aiming at. Begin with the end in mind.
Yes.
Because if you've got a sense of your target and you know the constraints within which you can aim at and try to hit that target, that filters out an extraordinary amount of noise. It's like knowing what station you're dialing to on the radio. That's when we were talking about the signal to noise ratio. If you remember manually dialing your radio before you just hit the button and it went to the next strong signal, when you had to manually dial the radio, you would get static, 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 sort of noise, but very staticky. And then you dial into a station. Well, if you're just randomly spinning the dial, you don't necessarily know what you land on. Maybe it's the Tejano station. Maybe it's the Christian talk show station. Maybe it's the secular talk station. Maybe it's the classical station. Maybe it's, the classic rock or the country station or the hip hop, whatever. But if you know what you're looking for, if you know you're trying to dial into the classical station, well, then you at least kind of have an idea. All right, it's going to be within, this section of the radio band. Or I know what it'll sound like when I hit it if I'm in a strange city. Like I've had to do that when I traveled for work.
Yeah.
It's like, okay, well, I can't find a classical station. Let me find a rock station.
Yeah. And so you're looking to, distinguish the signal from the noise. And then once you've figured out what signal you're looking for, you start looking for that executive summary to help clue you into, is this worth my time? And that way, rather than getting hit with every single math thing that you're looking for, you can find maths that are aligned with that end goal. And then you can look between 3 or 4 that might be worth more time and research.
So, pro tip, if you're talking to other home educators, or if you're reading homeschool product reviews, instead of asking, is this a good program or a bad program? Because while there are objectively superior and inferior curricula out there, is it good or bad is not going to be a very helpful line of inquiry, because that is ultimately going to be a subjective value judgment.
Yeah.
Where I would suggest you start asking the question is, how does it work for you? What do you like about this program? What do you dislike about this program? And so one of the math programs we use has a lot of manipulatives. We really like it and we like the results, but it's time intensive. And so if I'm talking with a couple, or a single parent who's embarked on this home education experiment, and they are very limited in time because they're still working a day job or they don't have the support of a spouse for whatever reason. How do I fit this in? I'm not necessarily going to suggest this fantastic math
Yeah.
program.
It's like it's got several elements. And then there's other things that even when you've got the time, one of the things it uses to teach is games. Well, the games are in general a fantastic way to teach because it's a way to drill without it being drilled. It
Yeah.
introduces an element of randomness, which I think is important. But if you've got only one child and you've now got mom versus second grader, it doesn't feel very fair.
There's such an imbalance, at least in the case of our kids, they just throw up their hands and quit. They couldn't win. Well, if you put an unwinnable condition on the table, then yeah, the sane reaction is to quit. It's only adults who are like, well, I just have to keep doing this because like that's my job.
Yeah.
Or, when we were in school, hey, this sucks. Well, you got to do this because that's what you have to do. Life shouldn't be that way.
Yeah.
There are certain things you have to hold your nose and do, but teaching your second grader arithmetic shouldn't be one of them.
And certainly not in a way where it's supposed to be fun.
So I would probably recommend something more like Khan Academy to someone in that situation,
if
because it's a little closer to outsourcing, and in that there are instructional videos,
less
there
time
are
intensive, less
self-reinforcing
resource
tests.
intensive, and it is not, and because it's designed for the individual student, you don't have things that work better if you have a classroom or at least a small group
Yes.
than if it's just mom and kid. Some things are not ideal for a single student situation.
Pew Cafe?
No, thank you. And so that's one of those ways that you deal with the information overload, is you start looking for those executive summaries that help you, again, get another level of filtering in. And then I think the third thing is just, okay, you've got all the information, but it's just, how do I organize the stuff? And I actually think that's a separate episode.
I agree.
Because how you start getting the big rocks in place. And actually, I think we'll finish up with this. There's an old story, one of those motivational speaker type things, where you've got a guy in a room and he's got this big old jar.
Stephen Covey, I believe, is the one who really popularized it, but it's
I heard it first in a homily.
Well, yeah, but that was after his 7 Habits of Highly Effective People came out.
But the story is, you've got a large glass jar, and your guy at the front of the room starts putting in some big rocks into the jar. And he asks his audience, is the jar full? And some people say yes, and some people say no. And then he starts putting in some smaller rocks, some gravel. He says, is the jar full? And some people say yes, and some people say no. And so now he pours in sand, filling in even more space into the jar. And now you're thinking that jar is pretty full. And it is, but there's still room, because now he pours in water. And after he's done all of this, he asks the audience, what's the lesson we can take from it? And some people, it's like, there's always room for more. And he pours some more water and it spills over the edge. It's like, no, the thing you should learn is you put in the big rocks first. And that's a way of looking at prioritization. And that the first step to organizing the stuff, once you've filtered out the stuff that you actually care about from the stuff that you've already determined is useless, is figuring out which things are the big rocks, which are the things that actually are the most important, that you're fitting everything else around.
What's your goal? What are your constraints? Big rocks first.
Yeah. And I think we'll definitely want to do another episode on actually more practically how to get those big rocks first in. But
As well as how do you manage the day to day?
yeah, there's overwhelm can be a huge topic, especially since as a homeschooler, you're not just saying, how do I educate my kids? You're saying, how do I do it while still managing a day job or a side hustle, possibly,
Or
while
both?
while still trying to make sure that people are getting food, while still trying to keep the house from being a complete disaster area. When you're doing this without staff to handle all of the stuff, how do you hire staff to handle elements of it? Those are all things that we definitely should plan another time to talk about. But for today, I think that's pretty clear. As you said, what was it? What's your goal? What are your constraints? Big rocks first.
Yeah.
All right.
Goal, constraints, big rocks first.
That seems like a pretty good executive summary of the
A good whole talk on setting the goal and handling the constraints.
Yes.
So
All righty.
I can talk for at least an hour on that topic.
Yes, you can.
All right. Thank you all very much. Hope you enjoyed today's stream. We will talk to you again next week. And if you have any questions, holler at us.
All right. Thank you. Bye.
Ciao, ciao.